Okay, another dichotomy that the biographer talks about is another one that I think about a lot. And that's because I write and illustrate children's books, so I tend to work on illustrating big ideas. That's kind of my wheelhouse. Philosophy for kids, medical diagnoses for kids. So I think a lot about the difference between fine art and illustrative art, and I consider myself an illustrator. However, I'm starting to do some fine art commissions and some fine art projects, and it's making me question the difference between what it is to be a fine artist and what it is to be an illustrator of a book. So I appreciated on page 37 when the biographer talked about the difference between serious artists and illustrators. Of course, this is all almost 100 years ago, so how serious someone takes their illustration career is very different now than the way an illustrator was perceived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So here's the quote. One reason why serious artists, a manner of speaking because the most serious artists are often the gayest, meaning the happiest, generally refer with a certain contempt to illustrators, is that art is not illustrating anything, at least in the outside world. It illustrates that it is. The greater part of those viewing a given exhibition of pictures, including some art connoisseurs, assume the pictures to be illustrating at the very least verbal ideas and meanings entertained by the artist beforehand. It is true, there have been painters who painted verbally expressible ideas. I think of Magritte, for example, who a lot of his work has to be explained with verbal engagement. But in their work there were other elements also that escaped the earnest searcher for a story. With great painters throughout the ages, it was generally a matter of indifference what their subjects meant. What did matter, with shapes, colours, the relation of objects to adjoining objects, the values of lighted objects as against those less lighted, how the object looked was its story, and its only story. A 20th century painter, Leon Kroll, used to say, great paintings have always been basically abstractions. So that's an area that I think about a lot because I'm often taking verbal concepts and I'm trying to create visual metaphors for them in my illustration work. So I'm often asking, what is the best visual representation of this abstraction? So for someone to argue that fine art is about abstraction itself and not anything to do with the verbal representation of it, it reminds me of this philosophy of aesthetics concept, which is that if you need a curator card next to the painting explaining what the painting is about, or sculpture or whatever, if you need a title or a critique to help you understand what you're looking at, there's an argument in the philosophy of art that the art is not doing its job. You shouldn't have to have words to explain it to you. And that it shouldn't be gaining in value with an explanation. As if it needs to be strong enough to stand on its own without language, as an international language, a visual language. Okay, other things that were big elements of this book. Gender and sex!